Thanks and welcome everyone to Sediment Stories 11. Uh, Today we will be speaking with Suraj. My name is Suraj. I work at Veditum India Foundation and I'm joined today as of now by my teammates Eshani, Ria, Madhapa and also Raya. And we'll initially start with an introduction, little bit of an introduction to Veditam as an organization and India Sandwatch, the project, and then go into a little bit of the description of sediment stories, and then talk about our speaker for today, and then get into the discussion. Veditam is an environmental nonprofit organization. The larger goal that we have as an organization is to transform how environmental governance happens in India. And we do that by doing three things: by creating evidence at scale, working with communities to take that evidence to and convert that into action, and building environmental leadership for the future. The journey for Veditam started when we started walking along rivers in India, documenting them, understanding them, working to take the stories of rivers and communities who live alongside rivers, particularly into the mainstream, amplify those voices, always maintaining that uh, the stories of the community and of the river, and we are only playing a part in that journey. But as we walked along these rivers across India, there was always the intention of trying to solve for problems that we were coming across. And one problem that we came across consistently over the years is the issue of sand mining that is very prevalent across rivers in India. And sand is something that we use for a large part in construction, but also in its various forms. We use it in almost everything around us. Almost all silica, right, that we use is in modern day equipments, technological devices, glass is coming from sand. And a large part of the construction sand that we receive in India is strip mined from India's rivers. And that leads to certain consequences. What India Sandwatch is trying to do is to look at this massive scale violence that is happening in India's rivers without accountability, with harm to the environment and ecology, and also harm to the people living alongside these rivers. The additional challenge with the kind of sand mining that happens in India is the corruption that is involved and the leakage in the public revenue collection system that happens because of the way it works. Um, so to address this challenge is how India Sandwatch came into being. India Sandwatch, which is a project at Veditam, is an environmental accountability project working to protect India's rivers from unsustainable and illegal sand mining. As part of the conversation, as part of the work at India Sandwatch, while we are building evidence in various ways, we're building toolkits for action, we're building ways of looking at the issue through collaborations, one of which you will hear later today. What we also understood is that the general understanding of the importance of sand and sediments in rivers for ecology, for people, is much less understood, lesser than what we would have ideally liked. So that's when we decided that we should work on building conversations around the idea of sediments and look at sediments as they get created in nature, as they become part of ecosystems, and how we extract them and the process of that extraction, the challenges associated with the extraction, the reporting on this. And as part of Sediment Stories, we have actually in the past spoken to geologists, journalists, activists, people working on storytelling, and there are some critical questions that we generally ask: where does sand come from? Where does it go? What role is it playing in ecosystems? How do governance mechanisms regulate or fail to regulate mining? Do we have alternatives to sand in our ecosystem? What role do scientists and civil society play in this overall situation? Um, and before I forget to mention, which usually happens because we as a team know this so well, is that India Sandwatch as a project has an open data platform at its heart, which we built in partnership with our friends at Ulloy Labs, and which is enabling the collection, annotation, and archiving of information related to sand mining in India. And now this database plus the toolkits that the team is developing is helping us to be able to track this challenge and issue at scale and also be able to respond to it at scale and build ways for people to take action. I'm very excited that we have one of our collaborators, Suraj, in the room with us today, talking about who will be talking about his work with the project Sand Mining Watch. But before we get into the conversation with Suraj, what I'd like to do is give you a brief introduction to Suraj. Over the years, I've developed a good friendship with Suraj. So what I'll do is I'll stick to reading out the bio so that you have a little bit of a formal introduction to Suraj. Suraj is a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. His research aims to better understand the interactions between human societies and their environment. Here, his work spans two interconnected themes. First, how economic activities influence and impact the local environment, and two, how climate change and natural disasters shape and influence economic activity. He is particularly interested in understanding how new data sets and computational tools can be used to study these interactions at highly granular scales, that is, at village level. And this led to his work with Veditum, where Veditum's project is attempting to measure the scale of sand mining in India using machine learning and satellite imagery. Suraj holds a PhD from UC Berkeley, where he studied development economics and data science. Prior to this, Suraj worked in the development sector in India, where he collaborated with researchers and policymakers to design and implement program evaluation studies. He earned his MA in development studies from IIT Madras. In his free time, and this is a great time, I guess, for Suraj in the US, he enjoys reading, going on long hikes, and playing and watching football. So, with that, Suraj, welcome to Sediment Stories.
Thanks, Sid. Happy to be here. Yeah, good to see everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for making time. And I know it's late night where you are, but will be good to have this conversation on the various challenges that we're together looking at, and know all the biases and the interests and the practices that you bring with you. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I think just to reemphasize for people who are in the audience today or who may be watching this later. Um, The project Suraj and our other collaborator Ando worked on together, Sand Mining Watch, which Suraj will talk about in a bit, is a collaborator with India Sand Watch, and we've built things together. So I'm super excited for this conversation to bring out more layers and nuances as part of that conversation. I'll start with a question for you, Suraj, and which goes your work with Sand Mining Watch looks at sand mining using machine learning. Um, But you were a developmental economist. How did your move happen from looking at development economics to machine learning, or is it still both?
I think yeah, thanks, Sid. I think it's still both. I think very much everything I do and everything I'm working on is, I think, informed by an interest in thinking about things from the perspective of development economics. I think for me, I view the computational tools and the new data sets and the algorithms and all of that as a way to measure and better study the problems we're interested in. And like I said, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the attractive thing about the new data sets and new computational tools is this ability to study some of the challenges we care about at highly granular levels. And there might be problems with that. There are definitely positives to that. We can, talk about both sides of it. But I think it opens up many possibilities, especially in a very large country like ours, to think about how we can measure and understand and study and monitor some of these challenges we face over large amounts of space and over long time periods in a way that is increasingly becoming hard to do either through surveys or through physical monitoring or through manual observation. This is not to say that those approaches aren't important. I think they're complementary, but we're at a time where I think all of these new methods and data sets open up very exciting possibilities. I think the speed at which things are changing, it's these tools and technologies are becoming accessible to everyone. Anybody with a computer and an internet connection can these days do access many of the data sets we're talking about or do many of the things I claim to do. So, I think it's an exciting time for this intersection.
Yeah, thanks. I, just picking on a bit of what you said that, at this moment where we are, it's possible for almost anybody who's got a computer and an internet connection is able to make use of newer tools that are available. So like a two-part question. One is like how does this surveying at scale work? And the second bit is, can you elaborate a little bit and maybe make it simple for people who are listening? What does it mean that if you have a computer and an internet connection, you can look
Yeah,
at things scale?
sure. So I think for context, before I, started work as a graduate student, I was in the development sector in India where my primary job was to work with policymakers or researchers in designing and implementing research studies that think very much about what is the impact of a particular program or what happens after a certain policy is introduced. And the traditional way you would approach that problem is to conduct a set of surveys before and after a certain policy has happened, if you have the flexibility to do that. Or you come up with some other way to collect that data, but still manually. And that's, I think the highest, usually that's going to give you what we call gold standard data, in the sense that it's the highest quality data. You're controlling how you're managing this data collection process. You're more working with a team of surveyors or enumerators, usually going from household to household collecting these data sets. I think the downside with those approaches is they're extremely time consuming. It's hard to keep going back to the same places again and again at high frequency. And when it comes to matters like sand, where there are more complicated situations and more complicated interests at play, you might not even get um, the kind of data you want. It's not easy to ask questions when it comes to matters like this. I think what has changed is in parallel, over time, you have a lot of data that's become available that revisits villages at much higher frequency. For instance, there's free satellite imagery available today on Earth Engine or any of these platforms that effectively allows you to look at the same village every week if you want to. Some of the higher resolution data sets allow you to think about household level analysis if you want. But I, where we're at, I think, is we have 10-meter imagery, which is, you can locate perhaps a big truck or a couple of big trucks, maybe not more than that. That's not quite right. You can locate a big house. Maybe that's the way to think about it. But you have these 10-meter image pixels available. That's available once a week, which is a fantastic pro, achievement in terms of progress. And this has become available in the last 10 years, and that's super powerful. Because a lot of it is made freely available through the efforts of various research agencies or organizations. Now, obviously, there's computational challenges, I guess, if you want to process and work with gigabytes of data or whatever. But traditionally, access to such data sets has been a first order issue. They used to be very expensive. They didn't used to be available publicly. You couldn't download them easily and work with them if you wanted to. I think we have tools now that don't require you to write code necessarily, that, through interactive dashboards or through using just a set of buttons, you can access some of this data. I think so. The barrier to access has come down a lot, which is a big change. That's not to suggest that anybody can download terabytes of data onto their computer. That's still far away. But at least knowing how to get to the raw source, I think, is much easier these days for anybody with internet connections, like I said. I think the other side of it is, what do you do with this data? You can use this data. So with satellite imagery, which is something I work with most commonly, I think it has this property that you can track and measure changes over time. That whether that's in forest cover, whether that's in sand mining, whether that's in any other type of land use change or human behavior pattern, you can that has a visual signature. So you can see some of these things over space and over time at high frequency. That's great. You still need some computational tools to then extract that information into a data set or to generate statistics with it. I think that's also been something that's had high barriers to entry before. But as more and more platforms out there start working with these data and converting them into usable formats for people like you or researchers or students or whoever it is, I think barriers to entry on that side too have come down a lot. We can talk more about like specifically how the machine learning works, but I think it's worth making this point that ha- these these even 5 years ago when I was starting my graduate studies, the barriers to access were much higher than they are now. And I think the rate at which things are changing, hopefully, it's going to get even better, right? So I think in terms of knowing where to start, I think we have made a lot of progress in the last few years, which is super exciting.
Right. Oh, that's great. I mean, it's almost I think in current times when we of course, with like with the El Nino and with how climate change is evolving, there's usually challenges, and the optimistic tone is difficult to find. So it's good to have a hopeful note in that context. I'm glad that is
Yeah.
there. But I'll push a little bit more on that bit from a perspective of wanting to learn. Is that for most of us, when we think about satellite data, right? Like you also described at a 10-meter resolution, sure, you can maybe look at a house, and maybe if you're looking at, say, something like a forest, you
Hmm.
can possibly understand, like, okay, visually I can see that the forest is there and it's not there. But
Yeah.
if you think, if you can explain to us a little bit in terms of, is it just like optical or not optical is not the right word, I guess, but the visible data that we are talking about, or is that
Yeah.
more? And
Yeah.
if you can maybe also take us into the question or into this thing with the example of sand, and like if you have visuals, I think that will be useful for people to
Yeah,
understand.
sure. I
So
can I can pull up a couple of visuals in a second. And I think really good questions. I think the nice thing today is you have many options available in terms of what's accessible. There are some satellites that purely capture information in red, green, and blue bands. So any photograph you see online usually is composed of red, green, and blue as the primary colors. And that's what your eye can usually just see with the naked eye. So you have that data available. Many satellites give you that at a decent resolution. What has become more common and what has become more easily accessible in the last few years is multispectral imagery, which captures portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that you cannot see with the human eye, but are tremendously powerful when it comes to picking up changes in on the Earth's surface. For example, infrared is a portion of the spectrum we cannot really see, but it's super useful for monitoring vegetation changes. Similarly, radar is another form of imaging, I guess, or form of satellite imagery that's commonly available now, freely available. That is extremely useful for us when we think about sand mining because we're thinking of an environment where there's a lot of water and we're trying to separate temporary water from more permanent forms of water. And we're trying to think about wet sand and things like that. So radar is super desirable in settings like that, where it's able to, it has really good uh, power in being able to separate out these different types of um, things in the context where there's a lot of water. So that's super useful. And I guess this is all everything I said previously applies. I think barriers to access for these things have lowered. Radar is a lot harder to work with. I think for even for me, I have no training in physics in that sense where I understand, the intricate details of how a radar satellite is going to be set up and how I'm going to make use of that imagery. But there are processed products available that you can use, and there's pretty well developed tutorials and code books out there that you can work with to wrangle that data into something that's helpful or useful for you. Sorry. So on the topic of sand mining, I think all of this comes together in a very nice way. So let me pull up a couple of visuals and I can show you what I mean. Um, let's see. So here on the left is, I think, a 4 meter resolution image of what a sand mine looks like from space, right? So here on the left, you're looking at the Son River in Bihar, and this is a mine over here. This is purely like optical imagery that you're looking at. So we're seeing this with the naked eye. And what we can do is look at a stack of images like this over time to understand how this mine has changed. We can train a machine learning model then to replicate that process at scale, which means that this manual detection problem that you and I are doing, where we look at this image and say that, this is a sand mine. These bits are probably just regular sandbanks. Everything else is outside the river. There's not much else going on there. And by looking at a stack of images at even this resolution, we can train machine learning models or algorithmic tools, whatever you want to call them, to go through that process of change detection. And in this setting, the fact that we're able to look at the same location using multiple sources of imagery, which pull data from different portions of the spectrum, is super useful in being able to help us track different ways in which these mines change over time. So that's very helpful. And even this image is higher resolution than, I guess, what's freely accessible to everyone, um, but not that much higher. So, you should expect slightly blurrier images that we're using to train our actual models, but it has this super appealing property that it's able to pick up these patterns, and then we can track that over time. Um,
Right. Uh, can you speak a little bit more in terms of how this tracking works?
yeah, I think so. Obviously, so on the left hand side here, I'm showing you manual labels that we've made. This is where SAID and many others involved in India Sandwatch have, with us, I guess, looked at these places, manually looking at how the surface of the earth has changed over time. And we've then figured out that these are sand mines. And we've drawn these orange masks, which explain where the mines are. So this is like we have a small data set of coming from maybe 100 sites across some rivers across the country where we're able to do this. That's a really time consuming process. Just for us to put all of that together, it probably took 6 to 8 months minimum, if not more, because we have to look at the imagery multiple times. There's a process of making sure what we are capturing is actually a mine. There's a whole, process. There's a lot of work that goes into looking at these mines and looking at these images and then making sense of them manually. I think, but at the end of the day, it becomes a somewhat rule-based process, right? In the sense that we are looking at only the surface we are looking only at the riverbed. We are looking for these patterns of scarring or pitting, or whatever you want to call them. We are trying to look at places where we see scarring and pitting showing up at some point and then staying, persisting for some amount of time. Um, Obviously, the river's changing over time, and we have to account for that. And so there are a set of ways in which, as humans, we would go about deciding whether some portion of this image is a mine or not. And what we can do is train models to replicate those ideas based on the data we have. So, given what we call ground truth on the left, which is actual high quality data that we've all constructed and validated, that tells you that this portion of the river is a mine and this portion is not. What we can do is train a model to go through that same decision making process. The difference is the model is way faster at it. It takes if it takes us 6 months to look at 100 sites and put these labels together, we can train a model that looks at all 60 rivers in North India, looking once a quarter, so 4 times a year over an 8-year period, and it will tell you whether there was a mine or not in each of those locations in a week. That's basically the time in which we're able to generate those detections right now, right? So I think this is that it's important here to understand, I think, that the fact that we have these manually developed labels is really, really important and valuable. It's the best quality data we have, but I think it comes with this huge time cost. And just imagine wanting to do this for every river in India. I think some of this you do in your datathons, which is where you have people thinking about the mining reports they've seen and trying to digitize that. Not they're not looking at imagery perhaps, but they're still trying to compile all of the information available on where mining is happening, and it's an incredibly time-consuming process, right? I think the main advantage these new data sources and these new models that we're building have bring to the front is you can very quickly look at it. A satellite image comes out over a village or a location you care about last week. You can basically use a model to look over the entire riverbed or the entire section you care about and very quickly generate these predictions. I think that's really the value of thinking about using these methods and tools. There's a monitoring aspect of it we can discuss. There's like a general transparency and data generation aspect of it, which I think becomes important. Um, but at the heart of it, I think that's what is going on here.
Right. Thanks for this. I wanted to understand a little bit in terms of, I think also for people who are listening in, what have you learned when running these models? Is there something that's come up that you'd like to share?
Yeah, of course, it's incredibly hard. I think, getting a model to do much, much better and be much faster than a human on tasks like this is doable, but it's extremely challenging. I think at the end of the day, for instance, in our project, where we've been talking for a while, Sid, we look at 60 rivers in the Ganga basin. I think the main challenge there is that no two rivers are the same, right? Rivers, as you move further to the south, the sort of natural geologic patterns change. As you move to the north, everything gets rockier. The nature of the rivers change. So being able to train these models in a way that works very well over space is already very challenging. Um, for use cases like ours, we're very, very interested that we get the predictions right. Not we do not want this model to be hallucinating and pretending that there is a mine where there is no mine, right? So that requires a lot of validation and careful work. And we've generally found that that becomes very hard in some settings. For instance, in along the Chambal, which is a river that we're all interested in, I think one thing that ends up happening is that's an area that's naturally very rocky and has these ravines, I guess. So there are these patterns that might look like scars from space. And so it is difficult then to using the limited amount of ground truth or labeled data we have to get the model to not generate these false positives where it thinks that a random canyon or a random ravine is a mine. It's not, it's just a bunch of rocks. So all of those things become hard. We still have so much work to do in terms of making sure that, the model is doing well in the Chambal, but also say in the Ajoy or some other river in West Bengal that we care about. And we might have to do then minor tweaks to ensure that the way the model works in West Bengal is correctly suited to local conditions there. And so there are a lot of these challenges. I think we've also sort of we've also learned outside of those challenges and possible biases. I think one thing that has stood out is there is a lot more mining than we imagined. That
Right.
seems to be happening across the country. I think our preliminary numbers suggest that in 2019, over the 14,000 villages on these 60 rivers that we're looking at, roughly 10% of them, conservatively speaking, were exposed to a mine. Now, we don't have the latest population numbers, but you can just imagine, at least according to Census 2011, that's 4 million people living in these villages exposed to mines directly. We don't know anything about upstream or downstream effects. We don't know anything about, the way in which a mine in one village influences neighboring villages yet. We're trying to study that. But the fact that we can come up with numbers like that using the tools we're building is, I think, helpful and powerful in making available to everybody this highly granular type of information, right? So now, ideally, as we work over the summer, we'll be able to pull that together, make sure it's quality controlled, and make sure that we are not making stuff up. And then we can do a lot more with that data. So we're learning on that front as well about, sure, like, okay, we have all of this data, and we have a model, and we can maybe track the mines, but we're also at a point where we're thinking a lot about what we can do with this data as we learn about what comes out of this process and what problems exist and as we fix them. So I think all of that is happening.
Right, right. No, I think that those numbers are a little mind-numbing also, no matter the fact that we look at this kind of information daily at India Sandwich. I think even to think that back in 2019 and using census 2011 data, I think those are challenges in themselves in terms of when data is locked, you cannot do, or you can do only as much. So I think it speaks to a certain extent about the need for open access under
Yeah.
many conditions. And just coming back to your point that if 4 million, and for an Indian audience, that's 40 lakh people that we're talking about who are directly exposed to a mine around them. And we are just talking about sand mines on rivers at the moment. We're not talking about all other kinds of mining and extractive industries, right? So, like,
Yeah.
it's just sand mines that we're talking about. Two things. One is, or three things that I'm taking from this. One is the bit that I mentioned regarding open access and the importance of it. The second being that, yes, while tools are available in the public domain and more people can use it, and the fact that it is possible. So, say, for example, agencies could do this if they wanted to, but no matter who does it, the need for quality control or control is super important for this to really work in a way that is useful. And the third bit,
Yeah.
which I want to sort of lead on to, is to say that you mentioned about a lot of people being exposed to this. But when you move from wearing, and like you've already exhibited that, the technologist's lens or technologists had to moving to wearing the developmental economist's hat. What does it mean from that perspective if we had to try to think of it from an economic standpoint with ecology somewhere in the conversation?
Yeah, let me start with that and then go back to the others. I think that's the really hard part about all of this, and that's why this is so complicated, right? I think now exposure is like just a way of defining what we observe in the data. That's and you should treat it as such. I think the reality is there's probably people in these villages working in these mines or benefiting from these mines in an economic sense. It's possible that some of them are renting out land. If we also know of instances where that doesn't work as in the way I described, but it is possible that local communities are, in an economic sense, involved in mining activities. Obviously, we do know that much of the material that's being mined is taken to cities far away and used for construction or whatever it is. But it is possible that there's a local economic benefit that's happening. Some of our preliminary results suggest this could be true. Um, Maybe not too preliminary to discuss, but we can say that that's certainly a channel that's really important to consider. So I don't think it's as simple as saying that, look, these mines are bad for everyone or everything. I think the reality is it's a really key ingredient for our economy, as you mentioned. And I think the challenge then becomes like, can we quantify in meaningful ways how the benefits accrue and who the benefits go to, and what the costs or the consequences or the damages are, right? I think anecdotally, we've seen and heard enough about how the mines cause flooding, or the mines cause erosion, or lead to a bunch of other environmental challenges. And I think the big issue and the big challenge for all of us, whether we work in research or whether we're thinking about a policymaker, or whether we think about somebody who's a local stakeholder who is interested in thinking about what can they do to manage their local resources. I think the challenge really becomes thinking about what the right response here is and how you formulate that response. I think shutting down, saying that arguing for mines to be shut down is definitely that has been done. It's not obvious that that's the right strategy everywhere. So coming up, thinking about how do we manage the fact that these extractive activities are generating economic benefits while possibly generating tremendous harm becomes this really interesting and challenging thing to think about and tackle. And that's kind of where that's what we're trying to think about systematically using this data next. We'll see how well we can say something on to formulate, like, it would be nice to say that this is the sort of type of economic benefit that's happening, and these are the ecological damages that are happening. And, in a very stylized, idealistic way, that data is useful because you could then think about policy formulations that try to allocate mining permissions or whatever in a way that respects the fact that some areas are probably generating tremendous damages while some areas are generating tremendous benefits. So we could do that. I think we're far away from that becoming a reality. But I think the starting point for us has to be to think about the fact that this is such a complicated and interconnected set of activities that's happening here. And it is possible that the most of the benefits end up going to folks living far away in cities because they are the direct beneficiaries of the construction boom or the urbanization that's happening. And most of the damages end up affecting local communities. That's a possibility we can't rule out or we haven't studied yet. And then we really do have to think about how we manage that fact, right? I think from a policy perspective, we do have district level mechanisms, I guess, to take mining revenues and send it back to the people and all of that. But I think this everything we're doing is is sort of part of what we're doing is also making and highlighting the fact that there's so much variation at a very local level in how all of this plays out, and then being able to map that and study that and think about how to help whoever is interested in formulating the right response is, I think, a big open area for all of us to work on. What and how that's going to go, I don't know. But I think without all of these pieces we're putting together, like, thinking about that becomes very challenging to begin with.
Right, right. Yeah, I think something that you mentioned is like one thinks about it a lot in terms of who are the beneficiaries and who are the people who are losing. And while there are where we have the district mineral fund in India, which requires that people who are uh, in an area where extraction is happening, there needs to be a deposit in the district mineral fund for local development. And even the terms of reference in a sand mine require for local quote unquote development to happen in a situation. But then I guess like given that we look at this so closely, my constant thought is that that happens when the extraction or the revenue is legal, because when there is no legal extraction, then there is no legal deposit requirement in the
Exactly.
BMF at all. So
Exactly.
yeah, I think that tension, I think, as quote unquote, as a citizen of India, we having been at the receiving end of the wrong receiving end of colonialism, we talk about repatriation and we talk about the differences between the East and the West, or the global North and the global South. But we have similar discrepancies within our own country where we talked about who's benefiting and who's not benefiting within our own country as well. So just on that point, um, are there data-driven ways for us to look at this? And you've touched upon it a little bit, and I think this is probably one of the last few questions that I have before we jump into audience questions. Like, what are
Yeah.
data-driven ways in which we can like look at this growing tension as India grows environmentally, of looking at the need for the commonly understood economic development and environmental tensions. So that at one point, and then I think the question also is that sure, you and I who are sitting far away or are looking at data in a way, in speaking in English, sitting in cities, talking about this, but how do we really take this back to people who it's being extracted from? Like, if there's something that you have in mind, you could possibly share.
Yeah. So on the first front, on the first question, I think for data driven approaches to be useful, it requires data to exist. I think one thing you and I have spoken about a lot, and one thing we've realized as we've worked on this a lot, is the sheer lack of data that's available if you want to think about village level outcomes. Our last census was 2011. The last economic survey was 2013, I think. The last economic census was 2013. We have a village level facilities data set through Mission Antyodaya, which came out a couple of years ago, but it doesn't give us everything we need. The questions we are all asking have to do with our villagers or our villages becoming wealthier or worse off over time. Are villages being impacted by certain types of environmental disasters, or what are the ecological damages happening in local villages um, on a time scale that is not a decade? We're interested in thinking about these things perhaps twice a year, perhaps monthly, perhaps weekly in some cases. And the reality is right now we haven't gotten to the point where we have all of that data available, right? Which is why I think the bit I said in the beginning is important, where I said ideally we want surveys and things like that. That's hard to do, and so we all try to sort of make what we can with all of these alternate data sources, satellites or social media data, whatever it is that different sets of people are using. But I think there is this pressing, really urgent need to think about how we generate data for our villages at a village level. Shrug is like a great initiative, as we all know, but even Shrug is accumulating all of these secondary data sets. And so the Shrug is limited by when the last data set became available. And so this is an open sort of question for everyone going forward, right? I think I mean, we can't control, I guess, the timelines at which a census happens. But anyway, a decade, measuring and monitoring these things over a scale of a decade is not perhaps what we need when sand mining or river related problems are changing in real time sometimes within a year. So how do we? There is this big conversation to be had about how we create that environment in which data is available and accessible. I think for me, like the fact that we can make data available at least through our project is one step in enabling data-driven analyses of the impacts of sand mining. Um, on our part, the sort of second part of the project that we're thinking about is how can we link the data we create on sand mining to at least the available data sets out there, so that we can ask this question from a statistical sense of what happens after a mine opens in a way that is rigorous and allows us to generate some estimates that are useful, at least for people who are formulating policy or thinking about what damages might be. So that's where we are. We haven't done too much beyond that right now in terms of being able to say, and all of this data will be made publicly available. So
Yeah.
everyone is once this is all out there, everyone who's interested in the problem is welcome to use that data to replicate our analysis or do other interesting analysis of their own. I believe that transparency and that access is a big thing and is important to set up. As far as local communities are concerned, I think our project or our work hasn't done much in terms of thinking about what is the next step then for these communities, assuming data is available or data is accessible. The one thing I will say is that through the work with India Sandwatch and Veditum, it has become clear the amount of power that citizens have, at least in being able to bring these issues to the fore. There are larger structural institutional constraints that sometimes, not sometimes, perhaps commonly prevent changes from happening at the speed at which we want. But I think the fact that local communities have a very important role to play in all of this is something we've all learned. I think um, data is just not going to appear from anywhere. And so I think citizen science and local communities have a really important role to play in all of this. I think we're getting to a stage where hopefully we can harness that power and build tools to sort of use that in ways that's productive for everyone. That's not something I personally do in my research. I have colleagues who do that. But I do think that's an important thing to think about and talk about and work towards. because it's all well and good for me to sit in at my laptop and stare at satellite images for a year, but I think the real sort of levers lie when people are able to do more with all of these resources. So
Right.
that's a good
Right.
question. I don't have good answers, but I am hopeful that we are moving in the right direction on that front.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much to take away from what you just said, and I don't want to leave the questions in the chat unanswered. We'll get to it in a minute. But from what you said, especially, I think it struck such a chord in regards to how obviously national level data sets like the census, which is door-to-door activities, or the NHFS, uh, it's not obviously easy to recreate every year or every week or every month. But in the absence of something that's more responsive, it feels like a lot of these situations are fait accompli uh, by default, right? That
Yeah.
the outcome is so, or the feedback is so far ahead in the future or so back in the past that the situation seems like it's done for by the time that any meaningful action can be taken. So the outcomes, seems like the fate in that situation is already sealed, and we are just like possibly just trying to justify it. Last bit, I think what I'd like for you to touch upon before we just take the questions from people in the room is you mentioned a little bit in regards to what role India Sandwatch and Veditum have played in the conversations that we've had and moving forward. If you'd like to maybe touch upon a little bit on that, and I think useful for people here in the room today and people who are watching later on would also be to maybe visually see some of this stuff in terms of predictions and sand mining identification that you've talked about. So I think just with that, I'll sort of pause my back and forth for now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, all of our work, I think, has been made possible by the fact that folks at India Sandwatch or Veditam or your collaborators and or people who are reporting information that ends up in your platform, all of that is what has made this monitoring at scale that we're thinking about. Let me be, let me say that again. All of that is, I think, what will make this monitoring at scale possible. We haven't quite done it yet. We're all working together on it. Um, Let me show you some of the outputs first, and then we can wrap up. So here are some of the examples of what we've been building together. So here, for instance, on the left is label data from a site that we've been looking at for a while. This is over the course of a year, I think. I believe the top image is 2021 and the bottom image is 2022. And on the left, the stuff in yellow that you see here is hand-generated labels of where mines are located. And on the right is what comes out of the model. What the model is going to be spitting out is imagery like this, where it thinks there's no mine, there's nothing happening. And in the areas where there's mines, you see this heat map type visualization. This here brighter indicates it's more likely that the mine exists, right? Now, in this image, you can already see a couple of issues. It gets a lot of what we think are mines right, but we didn't really label this bit in the left over here. This might be a mine that's just opened or perhaps slowly expanding. The model doesn't pick that up. And that's the same in the bottom as well, in the second year as well. Here's one way we can visualize everything that happens at scale then. So here we're looking at the 60 rivers along which we've generated detections in 2019. And the places in red are the places where we see mines being located, right? So we can go from looking at very site-specific things to looking at aggregate, to looking at scale over the entire Gangetic Basin. And we can then combine this with different types of data. Here's one example from Bihar, where here on the left, we have some data on permitted mines. That's in yellow over here. These are like other mines that are actually in this. It's the same. The underlying image is the same in these three panels. We've just annotated them slightly differently. So here in yellow, permitted mines. The red circles are actually areas where other mining activity has been observed. And then on the right is like this mask that comes out of our model, which seems to just suggest that there's a lot of mining happening here, right? And at least in this case, the takeaway is just that there's just a lot of mining happening outside the permitted areas. And this is not news to you. You, I think, are far more knowledgeable about all of this than I am. But I think it does it just emphasizes this point again about what is possible with our data and how what can be done. Now, obviously, none of this is possible without all of the shoe leather work that's been actually done by all the people doing the monitoring or helping us generate the labels. So I think it's worth mentioning that. And we can do a lot more. I think in the second portion of the project, we're then combining data on where these mines show up with additional information about social and economic indicators and other things to think about what happens after a mine opens and how that would impact people living in these villages or the local environment. So that's a challenging task because I think there then the goal changes from descriptive analysis of sorts to thinking about causal questions, and that's a harder version of the world to work in. But we're making progress, and we should have updates and insights for you soon.
Yeah,
But that is what all of this makes possible, right? And I think that's exciting. Um,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even from the time that we started India Sandbox, and I think early on we discovered each other and the conversations that have happened since, and like the trajectory that we have also seen in terms of what is possible by looking at things the way you all have been able to look at. I think it's phenomenal to see what is possible. I think even to understand what is possible, I think is a big step in like getting over the fait accompli situation to say that okay, this is possible. Now the question is whether we will do this or not, or whether
Right.
people responsible will do it or not.
Yeah. And I think what I would love to learn more about and, think about with you and everyone we work with is what this means for local communities. I mean, it's one thing, like I said, to create this data, thinking about how this can then make its way back to these communities in a way that they can hopefully use is a big question to answer, which I don't know anything about yet, because we're still finalizing all of this. But I think that's an exciting side of all of this as well.
Yeah,
Um,
no, no, thanks for this. I think we have a couple of questions that Tarini has asked. I think we can ask that.
yeah.
Uh,
So right now, I saw that question. So Tarni,
Can
I
I
think,
read out the question because I think
yeah,
people are
please.
watching this later on, so they know what the question is. First question by Tarini is curious about the software that allows you to monitor a village consistently over time. Tarini probably missed the name. So, Suraj, can you respond to that?
Yeah. So right now, I think we do not work with local communities to train them to identify mines or anything like that. I think since we're very much in the research phase, our perspective has been that we try and minimize harm as much as possible to anybody involved, given how sensitive this can be. So for that reason, we don't generally do surveys or anything like that, and we don't and we are not asking anybody to identify anything, which is why India Sandwatch is a good way in which this emerges, because if there is a report about a mine, that's what we end up using. And I think the second part of the question we briefly discussed, where I think we recognize that this is such a complicated set of relationships here, where there are genuine economic opportunities that these mines make available to local communities. So I don't think the goal here is to suggest that that's a bad thing. I think the goal, we're simply thinking about who benefits, who doesn't, and what the negative consequences of uncontrolled extraction might be. So I think that's very much the way we're thinking about it. Um, I'm
Right.
not sure if that's a satisfying answer, but happy to say more about it if necessary.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you ended up answering the second question that Tarini had. So I'll just read it out for the audience. So the
Oh,
question to which
sorry.
Suraj answered was, how much do you work with or train local communities in identifying mines? in some cases, like in Nagaland, I know that mines are also run by small landowner families who have no other economic opportunities, or they also rent out land to bigger landlords. So that has been answered by Suraj. I think Tarani's first question was simpler, where they asked, what is the software that allows you to monitor a village consistently over time?
Yeah, and that I think there's two pieces to that answer. One is imagery, satellite imagery, which is freely available. It's called, the source is called Sentinel, made available by the European Space Agency. The second piece of that is a machine learning model, which we build. That hasn't been made public yet. It will be soon. That model allows you to look at these images and figure out which portions of those images are likely to be mined or not. So there's two pieces there that determine, that allow us to do this monitoring that I've been describing.
Right. Thanks. Anybody else in the room who may have a question? We have time for like a couple of questions if anybody has anything. Even if it's anybody in the team, you can ask if you have anything. I have plenty I can ask.
I do have a hard stop in a few minutes, but
Yes.
happy to answer questions in that time.
Okay, so I think in the absence of questions, what I'll do is I'll ask you if there's anything you want to round this off that you want to add as some points.
Yeah, I think the bit firstly, thank you for having me. I think this has been great. It's always nice to talk to everybody about what we're doing and thinking a little more deeply about what we're doing. So that's been great. Um, I think the bit I wanted to say to wrap up maybe is, the larger underlying motivating issue perhaps that brings all of this together and all of us together is how we think about addressing environmental challenges in India in general while we continue to grow as an economy. I think that's not a challenge that's unique to sand mining. I think that's something that's going to show up in pretty much every aspect of our society, as over the next 20, 30 years, given the aggressive way in which the country is growing. And I think that creates all of the pieces we mentioned, the data bit, the measurement bit, the being able to connect, how we measure certain things to actual impacts or analysis of impacts. All of that becomes important in that context. And I think that's really one of the most exciting aspects of thinking about all of this, in the larger perspective. And I feel like there's so much opportunity and room for folks to work in that area. So that's something I'm very excited about and excited to think about. So
Yeah.
hopefully.
Okay, thanks, Suraj. Just take 2 more minutes of your time. Thanks first for joining us and for sharing this. I think it's a delicate dance around the challenge of data, environment, growth, and economics. I think it's sometimes difficult to wrap one's head around the complexities involved. So thank you for taking us through this journey. What I'll do is just quickly invite people who are here or watching this later on to check out the India Sandwatch platform. The link will be put in the chat here and also in the description of the YouTube video where this will be uploaded later on. You should also check out Sand Mining Watch. We'll put links to the references to Sand Mining Watch on the YouTube video as well in the description. You can follow us on Instagram at Veditum and at India Sandwatch. This is again in description and in the chat here. You can reach out to Suraj to have a chat if you are interested on his email address. We'll leave the email for Suraj here and also again in the description that we have. Lastly, I think if you feel inspired by listening to whatever you have heard today, inviting you to come use the toolkits that we've developed at India Sandwatch, participate in collaborative action through citizen action hours. That's something that we host every fortnight, where you can come work with us towards taking action on the issue of sand mining, or you can come and volunteer with Veditum. And you can leave your email in the chat if you're interested to join to learn more about the toolkits or come participate in the citizen action hours or to volunteer with us, the team will also leave a link in the description and in the chat where you can learn more about the toolkits. So with that, thanks so much, Suraj, for sharing so much of this complex web of things, but excited to continue working and also seeing updates coming out from India Sand Mining Watch.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Yes, thanks.